social impact jobs that are entry level that paid more than what I made in my entry level job in New York in advertising.
Maryam Mateen is on a mission to change the narrative around jobs that do good for the world.
When Second Day came into my life, I was just like, yeah, this is something that I would love to think about and work on every single day.
Through her organization Second Day, she's helping the next generation of workers launch careers at social enterprises.
There is a lot of jobs out there that people just don't see, right? They're not aware of jobs that pay six figures in social impact.
In this conversation, we get deep into the weeds about how she helps propel people into their careers.
The first few times you're sort of in your head and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm messaging a stranger. This is super weird.
And how she carved out a career for herself in a space she knew nothing about.
All my education and growing up and thinking about what I would do one day, it just didn't occur to me that that was a career that I could have. Nobody told me that that was a career I could have.
If you've ever even considered switching into a new field, there's definitely a lot to take away. I'm literally writing things down here, not even for the sake of this conversation, but just for my own personal use. Without further ado, here is Maryam Mateen from Second Day. So as a co-founder of an organization, I am aware that you probably wear many hats in your role. And I know one of the hats that you wear is that of a podcast host for Second Day's podcast, The Careers They Didn't Tell You About. And I love the title of that podcast, by the way. I think it's a really fascinating idea. I was curious, in your almost 40 episodes now that you've recorded, almost 40 interviews, does anyone stand out to you in terms of having a career that was something that was so unexpected for you that you were just like, oh my God, I can't believe someone gets paid to do this? Did you have any interviews like that?
I've had a lot of interviews like that. I think most recently, from a career perspective, the job that I was like, wow, yeah, I didn't think of it, but somebody has to have that job. He's a guy who for 6 or 7 years worked for the Baltimore Ravens football team and did all their community engagement work. And I thought that was really cool. I'm not so plugged into sports, but I grew up in Texas, so I understand the power of a football team in a city. And so the fact that his job was to put on community events with the Baltimore Ravens for 6 or 7 years was wild to me. So that conversation stands out as a job that I every now and then I'm like, wow, that's so crazy. And then there's a woman I met a few months ago, probably close to a year ago now, named Brittany Brady. And so she is a nonprofit leader in Dallas. And what I think about a lot with my conversation with her is her approach to leadership. So one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about is hierarchy structures in leadership, where typically you have somebody in charge and they give instructions and then everyone goes out and does it. She really tries to build a more circular form of hierarchy in leadership. And she sees her role not as being in charge of everybody, even though she's CEO, but really to be somebody who can remove blockers so that her team can get their work done. And so I think a lot about how she shows up as a leader, and that's really helped me a lot as I've developed as well. So those are two conversations that I think about a lot.
And the mission of the podcast is very much aligned with the mission of your organization, Second Day. Can you give us just a brief summary of what the work is that you're trying to do with Second Day?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I'm one of the co-founders. We started this organization on the side of our desks in 2017. We were all three of us still working other jobs, but what we saw from our own friend groups and doing a lot of research on this topic is that to get a job in social impact is really hard. A lot of our friends did not like their careers, were not excited about their jobs, really wanted to do something more meaningful, but couldn't figure out what that really looked like and what next steps they should be taking. And so the more we dug into it, we found that most people have that problem. If they want to do something impact-driven, there's no clear path into doing that. And so that was the idea that started Second Day, is what if we made it easier for people to get social impact jobs? So we developed what Second Day is over many, many iterations. And currently what we do is we run a program called the Impact Fellowship, in which we match college students. We focus on first-gen students, low-income students, students of color, and place them in paid internships at nonprofits and social enterprises. So they get great work experience. And then the added layer of what we do is a lot of professional development coaching. We focus a lot on how to be successful in your internship, but also think about what is your career going to look like long-term and how to intentionally go out and explore your options.
And just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, how would you define social impact in the career space?
That's probably one of the most common questions I get. And the kind of annoying answer is that everybody's going to have their own definition of social impact. There's something called a personal theory of change. So each of us individually have our own ways that we can contribute to the world. And so part of the journey is figuring out, like, how do I want to step into this space? And it could be a full-time job in this work. It could be volunteering. It could be something else entirely. It could change throughout your time. So everyone's going to have their own definition of social impact. So I'll say that first. In terms of how Second Day defines it, we're talking about it could be a for-profit, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a government agency, it could be an independent movement, but an organization that comes together every day to tackle a social challenge. So it's not secondary to the work, it's really like at the core of what they're doing every day. That's how we define social impact.
And is your background in social impact? Obviously, you're working with Second Day full-time now, but did you start your career in a social impact organization or in the social impact space? Or what was your professional journey prior to going full-time with Second Day?
Yeah, it was not particularly social impacty. And I think that's what got me really excited about this work in the first place, is because truly in like all my education and growing up and thinking about what I would do one day, it just didn't occur to me that that was a career that I could have. Nobody told me that that was a career I could have. I was very much told, go out, get a nice, safe job, make a bunch of money, and then go donate it later. And there is a lot that can be unpacked in that sentiment. But I think for me, that's sort of what I was introduced to. And so part of why I love Second Day is being able to change the narrative around that. But my background is in advertising, in product marketing. So I've done a lot of kind of more traditional for-profit type stuff, but a lot of the skills that I develop, I use every day now.
So you started your career in marketing and advertising, and you mentioned that you were starting to have conversations with your friends where you all wanted to do something more impactful. When you guys were getting to this point in all of your careers, there was no Second Day, as you mentioned, right? So how did you guys start the process of trying to find companies that are doing work that feel impactful and that are organizations that you felt connected to? How did you go out and start to build that network of these companies might be cool to work with, or let's learn more about this? Where did you go? How did you even start that process?
I mean, it's like a really messy thing, right? And I think that's so much of what drives me to work in like talent and career development in general, is that like there should be an easier way to explore that. Right now there isn't. So for us, what we really did is, one, we started by looking at the people around us who were doing something social impacty to start with. And we talked to them and we asked them to introduce us to their friends who do similar work. And you just start sort of building out this network, and you do this kind of chain effect of networking. And that was a huge part of how we built our connections and our awareness of the space. There are also a lot of resources that are out there and tools that already exist, and they're not complete and they're not perfect, but they're a good starting point. So you have job boards like Idealist, which just post nonprofit and social impact jobs. There are a bunch of websites. 80,000 Hours is one that I would name. And there is a LinkedIn page called Careers for Social Impact. So there are things that are out there. So if you're diligent and you take some time kind of going down the rabbit hole, you can start to get some ideas. And that's really how we got started, is just going out there and seeing what came up. And there's a bunch of other specifics that I can offer, but I'll kind of start there too.
Yeah, I definitely want to get more into the nitty gritty of how we get into that. But before we get there, something that came up for me is, I've wanted to do something more impactful as well. And I know a lot of my friends and people that I know, especially after they've been in a for-profit space for some time, they start to ask those deeper questions of, well, what's next? How do I contribute in a larger, more impactful way? And one of the tension points that a lot of people come up against, myself included, is, well, I'm in a good career now. I'm comfortable economically. And I feel like if I want to do something more impactful, I would have to sacrifice that. For yourself, having made that transition, was that your experience? Or if it was, how did you reckon with and how did you reckon with that? And how do you talk to people who are considering those similar transitions, that they think about those things?
The relationship between money and impact is really, really complicated, right? So I think, I'll share a couple of thoughts on this. So one is, I think there is a false narrative that it's a binary, right? That either you can go out and make a ton of money doing something you don't really like, or you can do something impactful and make no money and live on the street, but do something you care about. And that's not the reality, right? There is certainly a spectrum. I have seen social impact jobs that are entry level that paid more than what I made in my entry level job in New York in advertising, right? So, it's not to say that there are only jobs that will pay you $20,000 a year. Good luck. Those jobs definitely exist. And I would steer you far away from those. That's not, in my opinion, the right way to pursue social impact, because you're just going to burn out anyways and then not want to do it again. But I think that there is a lot of jobs out there that people just don't see, right? They're not aware of jobs that pay six figures in social impact. They don't know that there are jobs that have great benefits. They don't know that you can have a really good work-life balance working in certain companies and organizations. So part of it is just education, which is like what Second Day is also trying to do a bit of as well. So that's kind of one piece, is I would just name that, like, we've been fed that narrative, and that's definitely not the reality that I see. There are going to be trade-offs. Certainly, like, I am not going to make as much money running a nonprofit as I would be if I was going into investment banking. Like, there are going to be like some crazy like ends of the spectrum. But yeah, that's one thought. And then the way that I've navigated it for myself, and the way that I've sort of grappled with this question is, for me, when I was working at my last job, and I was like 25, 26, like I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. I was kind of just vibing in New York, and
as one does.
Yeah, as one does. You just vibe very expensively in New York. And I really I didn't hate what I was doing, but I was really bored. And so when Second Day came into my life, I was just like, yeah, this is something that I would love to think about and work on every single day. And so I moved out of New York. I moved into my parents' house, because it was, regardless of whether or not it's a nonprofit, if you're working in a startup, like if you're starting something from the ground up, there's going to be sacrifices. Like, I think people assume an investor is going to hand you a check day one and you're going to be able to pay yourself some crazy amount of money. That's almost never, ever how it works. So like, if you start something on your own, for-profit, nonprofit, it's going to be a challenge in that way. But to me, it came down to, yeah, this is a thing I want to work on every single day. And I feel good about that. And I think that long term, there is money to be made in this space. And turns out that is true. So that's another kind of insight into sort of my journey with it. And the third thing that I'll say is that it is okay for everybody's needs to be different, right? I think people often feel like they're selling out if they don't go into impact. So a lot of my students may help support their families. They may have a lot of student loans. Like, they have their own financial realities. And I've said to them, I was like, look, if you're getting a job offer from Google that is going to allow you to pay off your student loans and do what you need to do, take that job. Your career is decades. So if at certain points you need to take a job that is more based in like practical reality, that is okay. My advice is to stay plugged into issues that you care about, whether it's in your current job or thinking about your next job, whatever it might be. But all of those things are also going to ebb and flow, especially when it comes to just the realities of like surviving in the world we live in today.
I love the last thing that you just said. I love that it's a very measured approach where you don't have to forfeit any kind of financial security to do impact work. And I think so often that's a common issue that young people face, is we feel so rushed. Oh my God, my 20s are almost over. I'm starting a family. So it's like, if you want to get into this space, it's going to continue to be there. And I love that, although this is the work that you're in, the lane that you're in, you have a very measured approach about it. So I love that that's the angle. And I think that's advice that more people need to talk about, that it's not a binary. It's not one or the other. Or you could switch back and forth even, depending on how your situation develops over the course of your career. The last thing that you mentioned that I wanted to just make sure I didn't lose my train of thought on was when you mentioned you were living in New York and you were bored with your job. I think that's a space that a lot of people get to. And then that's where they start to have these existential questions, and we start to think about, well, how do I make a switch, or what could I do next? What advice do you have for people who are at that point and are trying to think about what they might want to get into? Maybe they're interested in social impact. Maybe it's just something else. They're not sure. You talk to a lot of young people. How do you try to guide them in terms of trying to figure out what different avenues they should pursue that might be a good fit for them?
I think that first, this is my advice to anybody who's feeling restless in their job, if they're in social impact or not social impact. A lot of this is the same advice. Start by reflecting on what's not working for you right now. Take the time to understand, is it the day-to-day that you're doing? Is that what's boring you? Do you not like the team you're working with every day? Do you feel like you're not learning anymore? Take time to really identify what has you bored, right? Is it the culture of the place? Like for me, at my last job, it was a really big bank. It was at Chase. And Chase is a really bureaucratic place. And there was nothing that I could do to make Chase move faster in terms of how they operate. That was never going to happen. So when I realized that that was the thing that was making me bored, I was like, okay, that's out of my control. And now I understand maybe I need to look outside. But maybe what's making people bored in their jobs or what they're not happy with can be controlled already. I also think that there's, particularly in like bigger places, or actually at smaller places, if they have the the budget and bandwidth to do this, but maybe there are projects you can get involved with like at your existing place that will get you more excited. So I always say the first step is to like pause and think about like what's going on, like why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling, and what is in my control, what can I make some changes on. And if in that you're like it's becoming clear to you that okay, I just need to like a full on switch, then I think the next step is talking to people, right? I think talking to people and hearing how they've built their careers, what their day-to-day looks like why they're energized by the work that they do. Even if you talk to someone and you, after that conversation, you're like, yeah, I definitely don't want to do that. You've learned something. You've gotten clarity on what you don't like, which is just as important as figuring out what you do like. So I think that's one thing. And I think that the third piece of advice I always give people is to remember that we all have a different relationship to our career. So as an example, I have friends who are new parents. And when I talk to them about how they think about their sense of self in relation to what they do every day in their career, it changes dramatically. So for a lot of them, their main self-identifier was that, oh, this is my job. And now for them, they're in a headspace where my self-identifier is that I'm a parent, and what I do day to day is like whatever, right? So I think part of it is, shifting the relationship we have with the career version of ourselves. And thinking about how you can engage on issues you care about, maybe outside of your job. Because again, to your point, like everybody has different realities of like what their day-to-day looks like. Maybe you're really bored in your job, but like maybe you really need that job. Maybe they're sponsoring your visa. Maybe, they're paying your school loans off, whatever. And you're like, I can't just quit because I'm bored. Redefining your relationship with your job and thinking about other ways to tap into things that you care about, I think also is really important and should be part of the conversation we're having.
That last point you just made basically summarized the last few years of my journey with my career, challenging my beliefs about work and what I want out of it. And for me, it's been so evident in reflecting on the messaging that I've gotten around work growing up from my parents and my grandparents, especially my grandparents who were immigrants, and hearing how they thought about work. And they didn't need work to fulfill a deeper purpose for them. For them, it was about the paycheck and providing for their family. And for my parents, it was something different. And so that's something that I've thought about as well so much for myself, and is what I would recommend as well is, have those deeper thoughts, those deeper conversations with yourself about what work means and what it needs to mean. And sometimes, as long as work could pay the bills, maybe you could get your fulfillment outside of work. Work. And sometimes you're better suited for getting your fulfillment outside of work. It's like someone who's an artist, for example, maybe going full time in your art will put a lot of stress on the thing that you care about. And it's no longer going to have this pure innocence to it anymore. So sometimes I think there is a rebalancing of what our expectations might be in terms of what we want out of work.
I think the artist example is so good because like in the work that I see in social impact, right? I see so many, not as many as I used to, thankfully. So I think we're seeing improvements here. But, historically, a lot of nonprofit, folks get really burnt out because they're being overworked and they're being underpaid and everything just sucks. And so they lose that sense of joy and fulfillment that they get because they're just miserable. So to your point, like you can care about an issue, but it doesn't, like the way that we engage with that issue can be different for everybody.
Absolutely. I wanted to circle back to when you were the first point that you had made in terms of giving a young person advice or anybody who's trying to think about different career. And you mentioned that the first step should be talking to people, picking other people's brains who are in that space. Obviously, it's very easy if you immediately know people who are in a career that you might be interested in. But a lot of times we might be interested in a career where we don't necessarily have direct or indirect contacts with people in that space. So in that situation, say somebody wanted to learn about, could be social impact, a social impact type job, or just any job in a field where they don't have any direct impact, any direct contacts. How would you suggest people start making connections with people through, say, some version of cold outreach? What would your approach to that be?
So the best thing to do is start with LinkedIn. And I know that people have all sorts of feelings about LinkedIn. I have found it like genuinely transformational for my business and for my like developing my own network, all of that. So get on LinkedIn. You don't have to post if you hate it. That's okay. But like be on it. And where it's really helpful for cold outreach is to find people that you can DM. So this like step by step, what I recommend people do is one, start with a list of companies or organizations that you're interested in. And you can even have a system where you're like, okay, once a week, I'm going to spend an hour going through job boards and websites and just compile a list of places that look vaguely interesting to me. Next step is to go into LinkedIn, pull up those pages on LinkedIn and look at their employee list. I always recommend DMing people who seem more junior in their careers because those are folks who can probably relate to you the most. If you're switching into that career or you're just coming out of college or whatever, they're usually really open to chat and share like how they got involved in the space. And so you can look for titles like analyst or associate or coordinator. If you see those, generally there's somebody who's younger, or you can even just go to their LinkedIn and see when they graduated or when they started their career, and you'll get a sense of how, far along they are. And then what I do is I send them a DM along the lines of, hey, so-and-so, I came across your profile in researching X thing. I was really excited to see that we both attended this school, or we are both interested in this thing. Like, find some point of connection if you're able to. If you're not able to, just focus on how amazing they are and don't be afraid to kiss a little bit of butt. And then have a really brief, like, I'm a recent graduate of this thing, and I've spent the last couple of years focusing on that, and would love to find 30 minutes to discuss this topic with you. Please let me know what the easiest way to coordinate a time to meet is. Thank you. And that's it. You can have a pre-written template where you just customize like the name and a little bit of the personal details. Once you get into that rhythm, you'll be surprised at how much easier it gets. The first few times you're sort of in your head and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm messaging a stranger. This is super weird. But honestly, in my experience, particularly in social impact, I will say, people are really excited to talk about their advice, talk about their career, share their advice, because they're passionate about it. And so if somebody else reaches out and says, I'm passionate about this too, they're like, hell yeah, let's talk, right? So I think that's one thing that I would say is sort of how I go about the cold outreach process. You're going to have people who don't ever respond. That doesn't mean they hate you. That doesn't mean you're being weird. People just like might not reply. We all don't reply to certain things. It's okay. Don't be afraid to follow up with people, and then don't be afraid to stay in touch with them. And I'm happy to speak to like sort of the best ways to stay in touch too, because I think that's part of the equation that people tend to forget. But in terms of cold outreach, that's honestly what I've done hundreds of times in the last couple of years, and it's made a big difference.
What is your approach to following up with people? Is that like a weekly thing, a monthly thing, or it just really is a case-by-case situation?
So there's a couple of scenarios. So scenario one is, let's say you've messaged someone and they haven't replied. 2 weeks or so is a very appropriate amount of time to nudge and say, hey, I wanted to follow up here to see if now is a better time to connect. That is like my go-to copy paste. I'm really outing myself. If people get my DMs, they're going to know exactly my formula now. But literally, I just send that and I have a day that I try and like do all of my DMs in a week so that I know, okay, 2 Wednesdays from now, I sent like 15 messages. Let me just send all my nudges to people who haven't replied. So I like try and keep it a little systematic. So that's one scenario. Let's say somebody does set up time with you and you have a great chat with them, or even if you don't have like the world's greatest chat with them, add them to some sort of spreadsheet or list of people that you have talked to when you last connected with them, and like check in regularly. Maybe if it's someone you really vibe with, they offer to do like every 4 to 8 weeks. Maybe it's somebody you're like, okay, that was cool, but like, I don't know if there's much more else I want to do here right now. Send them a quarterly, which is every 3 months, email with just saying, hey, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to share a little bit of what I've been up to lately, or maybe you want to like set up another time to chat with them again. Every situation is going to be a little bit different. Like, use your same kind of social cues you might use in regular life as well in this situation to figure out who you want to invest in. But I think that is a really critical piece of the puzzle.
I love that idea of scheduling the same time, or at least the same day every week. That way it becomes a bit of a habit. It's a bit systematic. And like you said, the follow-ups could happen a bit more regularly versus if you just try to cram it in, life gets in the way. But I think, and like you said, maybe an hour a week, right? It doesn't have to be a tremendous amount of time that you're investing in that. I wanted to ask you what your approach is. So say you reach out to somebody, cold outreach, they're excited. They say, hey, yeah, awesome, let's chat. What is your approach going into that call? How do you prepare? What kind of questions, what kind of angles do you come in? And what do you I guess what you get out of it depends where you're at in the process, but what are some general best practices for approaching that initial call with someone who's a total stranger, someone who you might be a little bit nervous talking to in a field that you may not know much about? So what are some best practices around that?
So I think the big thing to reflect on before you go into that call is to think about what your goal is coming out of that call. Are you really trying to just learn something? Is that company hiring and you're interested in working there? Are you trying to get connected to somebody else that they know? Are you just trying to, there's a lot of things that you could be trying to get out of that conversation. So kind of like pick an angle for yourself and start there. The next thing that I do is, of course, then try and craft questions around that theme that I've identified. But I also try and do a lot of research on that person, right? So people ask me often, is it creepy to stalk someone on LinkedIn and like do background research on them? I'm like, absolutely not. It makes that person really feel like you're prepared. That's always been my experience. So, saying something along the lines of, oh, I noticed that you got a math degree. I was curious to hear if your math degree has played a role in your career now. Or, oh, I saw you started in this particular industry and then switched in. Like, I'm curious, like what skills or experience you felt like that helped you when you made the crossover. So do background research, start coming up with questions. And then really the questions that you come up with as somebody who gets DM'd a lot for just like random networking. And I meet most people who reach out, but I will say 80% of people ask me the same questions over and over. And so I think that the conversations that are most memorable to me are the ones in which somebody has done that background research and comes at me with some more interesting, specific questions. And I think that strategy is particularly helpful if you're not necessarily looking for something specific from that person. You're just wanting to get them to like you and start developing a relationship. Coming up with really smart questions that go a layer deeper make a really big difference. And then you are more memorable to that person who might be having a lot of networking conversations with like young people who are eager to break into the space. So that's another piece of advice that I would give.
I think an important thing to remember too is that this is a skill, right? Like even if the first few outreaches don't go well or you don't hear back or the first few conversations don't go well, this is just another data point that you can learn from and improve upon going forward. So I think approaching it that way, maybe even if you expect your first time doing it's not going to go well, that makes it, if that gets you more in the position to be comfortable to reach out, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. What about if you're closer to the point of, say, knowing you want to transition into this field or in this company, and it's not just purely informational, where the whole conversation is going to be learning about them and their experience? How do you toe the line between coming off as memorable, like you said, asking great questions about that person, but also inserting yourself and trying to, show up in the conversation and maybe angle yourself for a position at their company or a position in that field or something like that? How do you try and approach and do it in a way where it's not salesy,
I think that you can be really authentic and also make an ask. Say, like, I saw that your company's hiring. I think that I would be a great fit for this role. What advice do you have for me? Is it possible that you'd be willing to be a referral, or is there someone you think I should talk to on that team? I'd love any insight you could give me. Make the ask, be respectful, obviously, but be specific, because I can also say that what a lot of people have said to me and like the experience that I have had is when people come to me for help but don't ask for what they need, then I'm like, I have to usually pull it out of people. I'm like, okay, you've put time on my calendar, like, let's get into what do you need? How can I be helpful? I'm here to help you. I need you to tell me what you're looking for. And so I think people feel really awkward and bad, like making an ask that way, but there is absolutely a way to do it. And I think a big part of it is showing up confidently and with clarity and humility. And that might be you acting, right? Like, I'm a big fake it till you make it kind of person, right? I like fully believe in pretending like you know what you're talking about and then, kind of making it work as you go. But like coming in really clear with like, hey, so this is me. This is what I'm really passionate about. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm curious to learn from you. And also, I noticed that you're hiring. Like, I'd love your advice or any support you could give me. I'll be applying to this role this week. Like, anything you can do to help. That's not weird. Just make the ask. Specifically, if you're feeling uncomfortable in the moment, right? This is another tactic. If you're like, I cannot get the words out of my mouth. send a thank you note. You should always send a thank you note within 24 hours. It can be super short, but send the thank you email. What I've even done, because I was finding that I was forgetting to send the thank you emails, is that as soon as I hung up the call, I would schedule send an email. That's one tactic. And if you want to make that ask, but you're feeling nervous in real time, send it in the email afterwards saying, hey, thank you so much for the conversation yesterday. It was so helpful. I actually saw that you're hiring for this particular role. I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a look at my application or connect me to someone on that team or even just be my referral. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Like, that's all you have to do. And honestly, being a referral is like huge for the applicant. It's zero effort on the part of the person that works there. So don't be afraid to ask for that.
I definitely learned the hard way about not remembering to send a thank you email. I was going to mention that myself, and so I'm glad you brought that up. And yeah, I don't know why I haven't thought about scheduling sending the emails either, because I do that for other stuff, but I've never thought to do that for the thank you email. And it's so easy. And like you said, do it right after the call so you don't forget to do that. So yeah, I'm definitely going to utilize that going forward. I also loved what you started out saying is, it's okay to be authentic and make an ask, right? And being specific with that ask. I think that's really great and really tidy advice to keep in mind. And like you said, it's not awkward. As long as you show up, I think, prepared and informed and you're engaging, it's okay. People are taking a call. They understand you might come with an ask. That's natural. I don't think
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that I say to people all the time, I work especially with college students, so this is the most relevant example for them. But I was like, imagine like a high schooler from like your old high school emailed you or DM'd you or whatever the kids are doing these days, and said, hey, I saw that you're a student at X school. It's my dream to go there, and I would love your advice on my application or any insight you could give me on your experience there. Chances are your response will be like, oh my gosh, of course, I'm happy to take 30 minutes to tell you about my experience and like be helpful. So you just have to remind yourself you are that kid, and it's okay. It's okay. The person on the other side does want to be helpful. So just make it easy for them to help you. That's the big theme here.
Something also to keep in mind is at the end of the day, generally speaking, most people like talking about themselves and they like sharing their experiences. So more times than not, yeah, it's not too big of an ask to be like, hey, I want to learn more about your experience. I think you're super interesting. More times than not, people be like, there's a little bit of flattery there. Of course, like you said, you have to be prudent about you doing your research and trying to stand out, but the ask is not as daunting as it might seem when you're trying to just reach out to people cold like that.
100%. I've actively used that strategy for people that I really want to impress, and then I want them to get to like me. I come up with questions that are very much layered with like, I'm so impressed by how you've done that, or I'm so interested in how, and those are things I'm genuinely interested in. I just like may lay it on a little bit thicker because to your point, yeah, people love talking about themselves. It's just human nature. So yeah.
Absolutely. So after you start to reach out to people and start building this network, maybe it's in a new field that you're trying to enter or that you're curious about, or maybe it's in your current field and you're just deploying these tactics to continually expand your professional network. How do you go about nurturing that and having frequent touch points with them? You mentioned it a little bit briefly about maybe quarterly sending out emails or something, but generally speaking, what kind of system do you use to, after you make a point of contact with somebody, say the conversation goes really well, you send them a thank you note, okay, when should I follow up? Or what should that follow-up look like where it's not, uncomfortable in any way, or what's a natural way to go about that?
Yeah, I have lots of systems that I use at various points because I'm not the most systems-oriented person, so I end up with a lot of different systems at once. But so generally, there's a few things that you can do. So step one, like I said, is create that spreadsheet of who you've talked to. Like even if it's just their name and the date you last connected with them, that's great. That's a good system to start with. And then what I do is I will either like every month look at my list and see, okay, who have I not talked to in a while, and send them a note. What I've also done is use my Google Calendar, right? So this can get really unwieldy if, like me, you talk to hundreds of people. So I don't do this with everybody, but with the few people who I really connect with and want to stay in touch with, I actually, in my calendar, set up a recurring reminder every 4 months or 2 months or 6 months to reach out to that person and check in with them. So you can find a system that works for you. In terms of what I email them, so one option is just sending them an update, right? I think I've said this before, and I say this to my students all the time. When people leave our program at second day, I often don't know what happens afterwards. And I would love to know, even if, it's just an email twice a year being like, hey, just wanted to let you know, like, this is what I'm doing. This has been the internship I've had recently. Like, your resource on this was super helpful. Like, hope you're doing well. Just that email makes a big difference. I got one of those today, and I can tell you it'll probably be one of like 4 I get all year, right? I don't get a lot of those, but I love those. So if you have somebody that you want to stay in touch with, but you don't have anything specific to talk about, send them an update. They really do appreciate it. And if you can layer in specifically like how your last conversation with them has shaped where you are now, like even better. But even just sending a generic, like, here's what's going on with me is awesome. Second thing you can do is actually just schedule another check-in, right? So let's say it's somebody that you have great conversations with. You can check in with them after X number of weeks or months and say, hey, I'd love to catch up, and just have another casual conversation and keep developing that relationship if the vibe you get is that they're into that and you're interested in doing that as well. The very extra thing that you can do is you can set up Google alerts for that person or that company where they work. And so when stuff happens there, you can have an excuse to email them being like, hey, so-and-so, I saw that you recently launched this thing. Congratulations. Like, were you involved in that project? It looks really cool. Hope you're doing well. That's like another level. And again, it's a lot to do that for everybody. But if you have a couple of people you're really trying to keep an eye on and you really want to stay close to, it's easy.
How does that work, by the way, setting up Google alerts for a specific person or company?
So I think it's been a while since I've done it, and you can actually Google how to do a Google alert. But there's basically a way in which you can say every time I think it's something like a new web page gets created in Google with that keyword in it, you'll get an alert saying, hey, this web page was published with the keyword so it might be the keyword of the person. It might just be the company that they use. So every time they publish an article or publish a new thing, you can like have that just sent to your inbox, letting you know. So
it's like cookies for these people.
It is. Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. So yeah, it can get out of hand. That's why you don't have too many Google alerts, because then your inbox gets flooded. But it is like another strategy.
I love that, because so much of the cookies and the tracking online is used to sell us stuff, and it's nice to hear these examples where we could reclaim some of those and use those for our own benefit. So I think it's
a good way to put
really
it.
Cool.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way.
One other thing I want to ask you about is the topic of mentorship. If you're reaching out to these people and having these informal conversations, how would you approach trying to get someone to be a mentor for you? Or say it's someone who you know directly in person, right? I don't think most people go about it with, hey, can you be my mentor? So how do you think about, or how do you advise people on trying to build those mentor-mentee relationships?
Yeah, people have a really interesting notion of mentors, I think, until they have a few themselves and can really see this in practice. So I think first, there are more than one type of mentor out there. I think there are the type of mentors who might have the dream career that you wish you could have, and you just want to follow their path and you're learning from them. There are also mentors who might work in a completely different field, but you really trust their judgment and you really get great advice from them, and they're a helpful soundboard. There also might be mentors who you don't talk to very frequently. It might be you talk to them twice a year, but they still are so helpful and give you fresh energy. So I think mentors look like a lot of different things, and they don't have to necessarily be connected to the space that you're interested in. Different mentors will play different roles in your own development. So that's one thing that I would just name up front. In terms of how to actually develop those, I mean, my approach is that if I have a conversation with someone who I respect, who I think is cool, who's doing something interesting, and we get along really well as two humans, I'm going to want them to be my mentor. And again, like what that actually looks like is going to be different on a case-by-case basis. But the best thing that I can do in that situation is stay in touch with them, right? So a lot of my mentors, all of my mentors, are not necessarily people who I was like, will you be my mentor? But they're people who I regularly stay in touch with. And the specific thing that I do is I keep them posted on how I'm using their advice and how I'm using the resources that they've shared, right? So one of my mentors sent me a bunch of her old pitch decks. And what I'm going to do is go through all of them and then email her saying, hey, just so you know, I went through all the pitch decks you sent me. This is what really stood out. Thank you so much. This was really helpful. Because you want to also indicate to a person that they are mentoring you. They may not realize they're mentoring you, but like if you can like really demonstrate that to them, that makes them feel good. And it also makes them feel like their time and energy and wisdom is being put to good use. So I think that honestly is the trick, in that there's no trick. You just stay in touch. You use the resources that they give. And the last piece of advice I would give on mentors is that it is a two-way relationship, right? And so a lot of people are, worried about not being able to contribute something to a mentor relationship. They're like, oh, I'm 20 years old. Like, what could I possibly offer this really interesting person who's much older than me? And I really believe both people have something to bring to that conversation. And so, for example, like, I love working with 20-year-olds every day because they're 10, I'm 10 years older than them, but they have a lot of insight into the world. They have a lot of insight into how people are talking about careers in college. They have a lot that they can help me stay plugged into. And so, think about like what you have to bring. I think bringing vulnerability, bringing interesting questions again, and also asking them about how they're doing, right? Like, so one of my mentors, I always ask her about like what business challenges she's facing these days, rather than just talking about whatever business challenge I'm facing. So ask them questions, give them space to also be vulnerable and share what's going on their mind. So, I think keep that in mind. There's two people in that relationship, and make sure you're honoring that too.
I'm literally writing things down here, not even for the sake of this conversation, but just for my own personal use.
I'm so glad.
Like, I've never thought about just not having somebody realize that they're your mentor, just building an organic relationship and picking their advice. At the end of the day, that's what a mentor is, right? Someone whose advice you seek. And I really love the point, especially I wrote down here, is letting them know how you're using that advice. Like you said, they want to feel like their time is valuable, but I think there's also a bit of an ego stroke that happens there too, which kind of feeds into them wanting to continue to talk to you and engage with you. So I think I'm definitely going to keep that in mind for myself. That's definitely going to be impactful for me and how I think about mentorship as well. Last thing I wanted to just end the conversation on here, because I think it's a topic that people are thinking about, is just the state of the job market. Obviously, there's some uncertainty in the economy, and we're hearing about job layoffs and stuff. And you're at the forefront of this. You're helping people trying to get jobs and finding out about job postings on a consistent basis. Are you noticing anything from your perspective, or what are your thoughts on it? If you have any opinions about the job market, and I'll ask you specifically for your industry, which is the social impact. Can you comment at all on that?
Yeah, I think that the world has been weird for what feels like forever now. So just naming that that's true. But I think my non-expert opinion is that certainly the tech industry, we all know there's a lot of headlines about it. The tech industry has been really impacted. And I think part of it is the economy. I also think we've found that part of it is the decisions that these tech companies themselves are making. It's not just external forces that are forcing them to fire everyone. So I think there is something happening in the tech industry that is its own beast. But what I've found in my industry is that there are still people hiring. I see amazing jobs every week. Like I say, I see jobs that pay very fairly or pay very well. So I do think that because there are so many headlines around tech layoffs, particularly people who haven't navigated the job market before are going to be very panicked seeing that. And I have that conversation often. People are like, okay, I'm seeing a lot of things that there's no jobs out there. Like, am I screwed? Like, what's going on? And I was like, yeah, if you're trying to get into big tech, you might have some challenges right now, but there's a lot of other jobs out there that are not big tech that I see are doing pretty well. And my memory of the last jobs, the Fed released whatever about unemployment rate, and we're doing better than people thought we were going to. So I would say yeah, there are headlines, there's some stuff to be worried about, but in what I'm seeing in the social impact side, there's still lots of exciting things out there that are worth checking out.
Miriam, if people want to learn more about you or about Second Day, what would be a good place for people to go?
A good place to start is our website, secondday.org. So secondday.org. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there as well. And then our podcast, as you mentioned, The Careers They Didn't Tell You About, is on Spotify and on Apple. So please check us out there.
And if anybody is trying to reach out to you for a quick 30-minute conversation, are you saying on the record you'll be open to that?
I will be very open to that. Absolutely. Please do DM me if you have stuff you want to talk about.
Miriam, thanks again for joining me today. I definitely learned a lot, and I hope to chat again soon.
Same here, Mike. I appreciate it.